The model is done. Now we have to make him move, which we do by rigging him. Even if you're not following along with the full character modeling tutorial, this can still be a good video to just learn how rigging works as a whole. I'm going to explain the basics of rigging first, but then I'll explain why you, as a beginner, might want to just use an add-on like Rigify to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But after all that, there's still going to be a lot of manual rigging to do as well, so I'm going to go into shape keys and drivers in the video after this when we rig his face. There's a lot to get into, so let's get started. Rigging can get complicated, so make sure to take breaks if you're getting overwhelmed by the info. Also, I brought back my background and floor because it looks nicer. Again, it's on my Gumroad. So what is rigging? When we want to pose or animate a character in 3D art, there really isn't a practical way to do it just by editing the model manually. You can technically just edit the character into a pose if you want just a static statue in that pose, and a lot of sculptors tend to do that, but rigging is absolutely necessary for animating the character. When you rig, you add bones to the character, and assign each vertex on the model to follow each bone to some degree, which means we can just move the bones to move the model instead. And more importantly, we can edit how much each vertex is pulled along by each bone to make the model move exactly how we want it to every time. Once all of that is done, then it becomes super easy to save poses and return the whole model back to its rest pose. It takes a lot of work to get a perfect rig, but once it's done, you can do so many fun things with your character, so it's usually worth it. This is just for an example, so you don't have to make this yourself, but I'm going to quickly go over the whole rigging process with a simple model first, so you know what to expect. Here I have a basic cylinder, which we want to look like an arm when we move it. First, to make sure if something's riggable, we need to look at its geometry. This is just a plain cylinder, which will not work at all, assuming you want to rig this like an organic arm. If we're going to bend this, it needs an elbow loop at least, so let's add a new loop, but this still isn't enough. If you want the arm to maintain its shape, we're going to need what are basically full cylinders for each side of the elbow, with the elbow loop being the one that acts as a sort of smoothed out midpoint for each length of the arm. Think of it like that one type of plastic straw that has that one bendy section in between two solid sections. The two solid sections can maintain their shape since all the bending is done at the elbow. So we can use the bevel tool to split it in two, then scroll up to add a loop back to the middle. Now this is riggable. This general method of adding geometry is necessary for any joint too. Like for example, on the hand, you can think of the forearm and hand as the main solid points, and then they need a wrist loop in between them to be the smooth middle point. There are more perfect ways to make the joint bend how you want, but this is just the basics. To add a bone, go to Add, Armature, and then Single Bone. Armature is the term for a group of bones, so it's basically the skeleton. Anyway, this is what bones look like in Blender. They don't look like literal bones, although a real bone is used for a lot of the relevant icons in the program. If we have it selected and go into edit mode, we can duplicate it and extrude another bone from its joints, which will be connected at that point, which use the same shortcuts of Shift D and E. Let's attach the model to this. First, leave the model where it is, so we can add bones where they should be instead. We need to place the first bone joint at the shoulder of the arm, the second at the elbow, and the last at the wrist, so the model will bend at those joints. If we quickly move them close, the model is covering up the bones, but we can make it so the bones are on top. In the Properties panel, if you go into either the Object or Data tabs, there's this Viewport Display section where we can toggle on In Front, which, will put this object in front of all other objects. Although in the Data tab, but you can also change what the bones look like by default. I'll keep it as an octahedral, but I also turn it to stick sometimes, if that gets in the way. But also, go into the Object tab for the model, because we can't tell where our loops are when we're not in edit mode. In the exact same location as the bone's visibility button, you can turn on wireframe and all edges, so it'll always show us where they are. Now it's a lot easier to put them into place. That's good if you just want to quickly put the joints into place, but we want to be more exact than this. So we should use the 3D cursor to put each joint in the exact point we need them to be in. I'll Alt select the shoulder loop in edit mode. Then press Shift S to bring up this menu, which we can use to either move our selection to the cursor or our cursor to the selection. You want to move our cursor to the selection at first, so click that. Now it's right in the middle of that circle. So we can go into edit mode with the armature, select just the joint at the bottom, and then go back into the Shift S menu, and then click Selection to Cursor. And now that joint is in the exact perfect location. A lot of bones and more complicated models won't be this straightforward, but then you can just eyeball it instead. Let's repeat the process for the rest of the arm. Select the loop, Shift S, cursor to selected, swap edit modes, select the joint, Shift S, selection to cursor. Then again for the wrist. When you're doing this a lot, it can get a bit mind-numbing, so I sometimes screw up the order. I started using Tab to switch between edit and object mode, so I can do it even faster. Now it's all in place. In edit mode, let's go into the bone tab so we can rename them to upper and lower, just so we remember which is which. So how do we attach it to the model? That process is called parenting. Obviously, in this context, it means that there's a child object and a parent object, and the child follows whatever the parent does. So in the case of rigging, the mesh, or the physical part of the model, is the child, and the rig is the parent, since the mesh is supposed to follow the position of the bones. To parent something, make sure you do it in the right order. In object mode, select the child first, which is the mesh, and then select the parent second, which is the rig. The mesh should be outlined in a darker orange, and the rig should be outlined in a lighter orange. Then press Ctrl P to parent. The top 4 options are just for basic object parenting, which we don't want. We want the stuff under the armature deform section. We'll use both empty groups and automatic weights for the example, since both have their own uses. First, I'll click automatic weights. So here's everything that happened. First, it added an armature modifier to the modifier list of the model, which is the main way it moves the model in the first place. Then it also gave the model some weights automatically. If you select the model, go to the green data tab, then up here to vertex groups. These have a ton of uses, but in our case, they determine which vertices follow which bones, and how much. It's kind of hard to see, so let's go into another new mode, weight paint mode. This changes up our view of the model and shows us this sort of heat map to represent how much of each section of the model is being pulled along by each bone. The gradient starts at dark blue, or no influence whatsoever, and then goes in a rainbow up to red, which is 1, or complete exact influence. Like most things, you can think of it like 0% and 100%. You can see what each weight group is influencing by selecting them in the vertex group section. And while in weight paint mode, you can do exactly that. If you grab this tool on the left, it's a brush, which we can use to paint the weights onto the model. Bring out the panel on the right with N, and then go to the tool section, and we can edit our tool settings there, like brush size, strength, and what weight percent you want to be applying. Now if you paint on a weight of 1 with a strength of 1, you can see it's turning the vertex I painted over red, and is adding the rainbow gradient around to the surrounding area. You need to have wireframe visible for this section if you don't want to go insane. Weight painting only affects vertices, so if you don't know where the vertices are, you'll try painting into some random spot, wondering why nothing's happening. If your model was way more detailed than this, you can get away with not having it on, but I think it never hurts to have it on, so just do it. I'll undo all the weight changes I made, and select the armature. If you look into the mode menu, we can see that we actually have a pose mode now, which is what you use to pose and animate these bones and whatever's parented to them. In that mode, you can rotate these bones, and they'll rotate exactly where their joint is, which, since we set it up right, is exactly where the elbow loop is. However, our modifier order is a bit wrong. It added the armature modifier under the subdivision modifier, which makes things look a bit off. You always want to have the armature modifier above the subdivision modifier, so the bones will move the base geometry before it gets smoothed out, and then the subdiv modifier makes it look way smoother after it's posed. Not only that, but it also has to move around less vertices, which should make things lag a bit less. Honestly, in this case, it didn't look that bad before, but in all other cases, it's absolutely necessary to do that. And also, one of the best ways to weight paint is to actually do it while the model is posed. While posed, you can go into the mode all the same, but when you paint new weights, it'll update live to match the rig. So if I apply a bit of the upper bone to this part, you can see the verts go back to where they were since the upper bone wasn't moved. That's obviously not something we want, but it's the best way to make sure the model bends like you want it when you're fixing everything up. To reset the pose, you select the bones in pose mode and press Alt-R to reset their rotation, bringing them back to their rest pose. You can also press Alt-G and S to reset their location and scale respectively when you need to do that. This is the main reason why you can't pose without bones. It's so much harder to reset a pose without them. I also want to tell you how the empty groups option works. You can unparent an object by selecting it and pressing Alt-P, and then clear parent. That'll get rid of the armature modifier. We'll also have to delete the weight vertex groups, so over here just press the minus button to delete them. Now let's reparent, but select empty groups instead. This looks mostly the same, but if we go into weight paint mode, it didn't actually assign any weights at all, even though it added the vertex groups like usual. This way we can do everything manually, which is nice when the weight painting process needs to be exact. Instead of going into weight paint mode, just go into edit mode. Here we can assign weights to the vertices as well. The vertex group section now has some new buttons under it. So if you select a vertex, choose what weight you want to apply, and press assign. It'll assign that weight to that vert exactly. To show how it would work here, select both the upper loops and assign a weight of 1 while upper is selected. Then both of the lower loops and assign a 1 while lower is selected. For the elbow loop, select it and then change the weight down to 0.5 or 50%. Then assign that to both vertex groups, so the total amount of influence is at 1 or 100%. If the total isn't at 1, some verts will get slightly left behind by the bone since they aren't getting fully pulled along. Now, it's pretty much exactly the same as the automatic weights, but you learned a bit more, so it's worth it. You'll be using both methods in the final model, so I needed to tell you how it worked. It's best to use a mix, since they both have their own pros and cons. Now for the last thing for the example, which is quickly how animation works. Animation can get extremely complex, so I'll just show you how it happens. First, take note of the panel at the bottom of the screen. This is the timeline, which is used for animation. We can determine how many frames we want our animation to have up here, so I'll turn the end frame down to just 30 to keep it simple. You can move it left and right with the middle mouse and scroll to zoom, just like in the viewport. Now the way you animate is by marking keyframes while in pose mode, which will tell the program to have these bones in this exact position at this point in the timeline. Let's mark the default pose as our first keyframe, so press A to select all bones, and then I to mark the keyframe. Then click and drag on the bar with the numbers at the top to move the playhead somewhere else on the timeline. And then change the bones in any way, whether it's rotating, moving, or scaling. Then select all bones and hit I again to mark their new position as a keyframe. You place keyframes wherever the playhead is on the timeline, and you can see the markers that denote each one as well. Now if we press space to play what we have, you can see that the program fills in each frame between those keyframes, so it moves smoothly between them. That's called interpolation, and it's a nice part of 3D animation that 2D drawn animation doesn't have. That's how animation in 3D works, but obviously it gets infinitely more complex than that, even aside from just having to pose a full rig's worth of bones. But you'll deal with that later. There's so much to 3D animation that if I told you it all right now, we'd be here all day. Since rigging can get complex, I'll tell you some useful resources for screenshotting and recording issues you're having, which will make it way easier to help you when you need it. For one, it seems like a surprising amount of people don't know this, but you have the print screen key on your keyboard, which will take a screenshot and add it to your clipboard. So you can then Control V and paste it somewhere, like a Discord server help channel, so people can have a clear view of your screen. I'm not sure if Mac users have a similar thing though. But even better than that, you can also press Windows Shift S to activate the snipping tool, where you can drag a rectangle over your screen and create a similar kind of screenshot just over the area you selected. I just noticed while writing this, but you can even record a portion of the screen with it too. And then you can trim your recording down and save it as an MP4 file or as a GIF, which is even more helpful for showing where a rig might be going wrong. If you don't have that function though, I also use a site called gifcap.dev, where you can do a similar thing. You just start the recording, select what window you want to record it, and then it'll let you trim down and crop the recording, and then export it as a simple low-quality GIF. Or you could even download OBS, which is an amazing and free recording software if you need to record longer and more detailed things. I use OBS to record everything, so it's really good. I'd recommend getting it no matter what. Anyway, that's all you really need to send as much helpful troubleshooting stuff as possible. There's also this video by Joey Carlino, which has a lot of tips and fixes you can follow if I don't mention them. They're pretty good watch anyway. Let's get back to the actual model now. Back in our model, try to think about how we want to add bones to this guy. You can at least partially use an actual skeleton as a reference, since you want to add 2 bones for the arms and legs, maybe a couple for the spine, probably none for the rib cage since you don't really move that part. But that's a lot of bones. You can add them and move them into place if you want, but even if you did do that, the resulting rig wouldn't be a lot fun to use. There are a lot of extra things you'd have to learn to get it all working in a way that feels good, and that's like months of learning, all for one single rig. Instead, we can just use an add-on for that, which is called Rigify. This thing is a lifesaver. Essentially what it does is it gives you a pre-made Metarig, which you can move into place and sort out how your character needs it, and then you can press generate to create a new, infinitely more complex rig using the Metarig bones as a reference point for all the various parts. And since the word generate has been corrupted by AI, I'll just tell you that this doesn't use any AI. This add-on has existed long before AI could do anything. It just uses algorithms and scripts or whatever to make the new rig. Although to some, it still might feel a bit cheap to skip all this work. So I'll tell you, when I say that creating a rig this complex takes an insane amount of effort, I genuinely mean it. It's so much that you, as a beginner, shouldn't really worry about it right now. It's so much fun to pose a character you've made, and an add-on like Rigify will get you to that point so much faster, and with much more fun results. You can learn about how to make a rig like this in the future, but just use the add-on for now, and you can start climbing the waterfall that is making a perfect rig once you're more used to the whole process. Also, we're only going to use Rigify for the body. There's still going to be a ton of manual rigging for the face, so at least do all that first before you decide that you're going to learn how to make a perfect rig yourself. There are also some similar add-ons, like Auto Rig Pro, which you could try if you don't like Rigify's methods for some reason. I don't know those though, I've only ever used Rigify. And that's another thing, this isn't some simplified beginner method that only beginners would use. I use Rigify to rig almost all of my models, at least a little bit, so Rigify is genuinely useful for your entire modeling career. I mean, you'd probably have someone make a purely custom rig if you're going into a truly professional space, but for a semi-pro enthusiast like myself, I use it all the time. But if you're an aspiring game developer, here's what you need to know. Rigify, as far as I know, does not translate well to game engines, since it has too many functions that only work in Blender itself. The model you made up until this point does work for basically anything that might want 3D art, including games, or at least I think so. But in order to rig him for games, you might need to look up separate tutorials on how to do that optimally for whatever game engine you want to use. I don't know anything about making games, so don't look to me for that info. If you do know games, please share your knowledge with everyone, even if it's in the form of a random casual YouTube tutorial. But if you're just thinking about posing or animating your character in Blender, definitely do use Rigify. I get so many people talking about games in my comments despite the fact that I'm only thinking about making animation in Blender, so I had to at least bring it up. Anyway, even though I told you at the start of the series, I'll tell you again. You get add-ons by going to Edit, Preferences, Get Extensions, enabling internet access, and then installing add-ons from there. But Rigify is actually pre-downloaded by default, so just go to the add-ons section, search for the Rigify add-on, and enable it. Now if you go to Add, Armature, and then Rigify Metarigs, it gives us a ton of pre-built metarigs to work with. The human one is at the top, but there are also animal ones too, if you're into that. In the basic option, there's a basic human metarig, but that one doesn't have finger bones, so we want the full human one instead. If your character doesn't have any fingers or a normal face, you might as well use the basic one. Once it's added in, it's a bit small because it's built for realistic human size, and our model technically is like 3 times the size of a normal human in real world scale. But don't worry about all that, just scale the rig up to match our size. Then turn on In Front View in the Object or Data tabs. Then while we're at it, turn on wireframe visibility for all objects. You can do that by selecting all of them, going into the Object tab, turning on wireframe in all edges, and then for both, right-click, and then select Copy to Selected. That'll make them all have the wireframe on. It has too much detail because of our Outline and Solidify modifier, so just disable it for now. Also, I like keeping the rigs in a separate collection to the body of the mesh, so I'll add 2 collections inside of my character collection, one called Body, and the other called Rig. I do this because if I don't, all of my meshes will get sorted under the armature list, making them much more annoying to find later. If they're in different collections, though, they'll always remain at normal view. Now we just need to move all these bones into place. But that massive nest of face bones is probably glaring at you, so the good news is that we don't need it, and we should delete it. I sometimes use just the mouth section, but the rest of it is completely useless to us. The eyes, specifically, are designed for spherical eyes, but ours are just planes. Also, I don't know about you, but I'm not planning on animating the ears. In edit mode, press C to go into brush select mode, and select everything around the head area, but make sure to deselect the head bone by clicking on it again. Then, X or delete to delete. Click on the head bone and press H to hide it, to make sure there isn't a smaller bone inside of it. That smaller bone is the face bone, and the script will freak out if it reads that a face bone exists, but all the bones on the face are gone. If it's not there, you're good. And just undo or Alt-H to get the head bone back. Now we're ready to start putting things everywhere. This whole process is mostly straightforward, it just takes some time. First off, in edit mode, press N to bring out this bit and go to Tool and select X-axis mirror. That'll mirror all your changes across the center, since armatures don't have modifiers. Things like the shoulders can just be ad-libbed. But you can select the elbow loop, Shift-S, cursor to selected, and then selection to cursor, the elbow joint to there. Same for the legs and the knees. Put the ankles and toe in, But this bone in the back is used to determine how wide the feet are, so make it as wide as the feet and put it at the heel. You can grab the joints and move them around to make the bone bigger too. The hip bones go around here, but this is one of the places where you have to be careful. These bones aren't connected, so you'll need to make sure you move both joints at the same time. There are a couple places that are like this, and places like where the neck is attached to the spine might cause the script to break if they're not in the exact same position. What I do for these joints is I use the brush select to select the joint that's supposed to be connected, which will select that joint of both bones so you can gently move it down to wherever the bottom of the crotch is. If they do disconnect, you can use Shift S and then put the cursor on one joint and then move the other joint to there. I think these bones pointing out are supposed to be going only as far out as the skin of their area, but I haven't had too much trouble with it anyway. For the spine, make sure it's actually somewhere in the middle of the model, even though we know real spines are more towards the back. This includes breastbones too, which you can delete if you don't want them, but I'll keep them just on the off chance we want to animate him breathing heavily or something. The top two parts of the spine are the neck, and remember that this joint is disconnected, so make sure to brush select the joint and move it to keep them together. Then, the head bone goes just barely above where the head and neck connect. I'm not 100% sure I place all the bones correctly, but they should work well enough where they are. Now for the hands. First, I have to delete the bones at the fingertips, because our fingers have one less joint. It'll work all the same. It'll also work if you delete one finger too. Just make sure you delete the palm bone for it as well. You can see that the palm bone and finger bones are disconnected, so brush select this joint if you want to move it. Now, with the main hand bone in place, you can select a full finger of bones and move that into place. Then, we can slowly but surely use Shift S to select the top and bottom vert, or loop of verts, put the cursor there, and then move that joint to that spot. You can also wing it, as long as you make sure that the joint is right in the middle of the loop. But with all the little corrections you'll be making, it might actually save time to just use the Shift S method. I'm making the knuckle joint a little farther into the hand, since we have a little webbing in between that part that covers it up. The inner thumb isn't as simple, so just move it a little ways into the hand. Now I need to tell you that we're actually doing something wrong here, but it's easier to explain if you see how it screws up when we generate the rig. Once it's all done, go into the Data tab and press Generate. But since the Metarig is in place, I'll at least tell you that you can actually use the Metarig as a normal rig if you want. It's just a bunch of bones anyway, so it's similar to what you'd end up with making your own rig without Rigify. So you can parent the model to the Metarig to see what I mean when I say a rig like this is a lot less fun to use. How do you keep the feet on the ground? How do you edit these various parts if you want to refine the look? How do you curl the finger without having to move every bone individually? It could be worse, but I'm here to say that the Rigify rig is just way better, so let's generate it. First, if one of the problematic bone joints was disconnected, what you'll see is a rig made of a lot of transparent octahedral bones. Undo and go back into the Metarig to check that the base of the neck is where it should be. I'll be honest, I thought before recording this that the fingers and pelvis would also cause the error too, but it turns out they don't, so the more you know. You still want to keep them together though. If it succeeded, it should look like this, with a bunch of custom shapes for each bone. But it's too small. Undo, then with the Metarig selected, press Ctrl A and then press Scale. That'll change its scale back to 1, meaning it'll now recognize its current size as its default size. Generate the rig again. Now it's all in place, but it needs to be in front again. Also, hide the Metarig. Now you can see the sheer amount of bones and controls it added, but thankfully it also generated some nice buttons that we can use to hide a bunch of them. I'll explain what all this is later, but turn off the torso tweak, the finger detail, the FK and tweak of both the arms and legs. And now it's way easier to look at. I'll also turn off wireframe from the model, which means we can turn on the outline again too. Now click on your model, shift-click the new rig, Control-P, and then do automatic weights. That should do 99% of the work on its own. Then, if you go into pose mode with the new rig, you can grab these controls and move them around, and you can pose the character. Although the other bits of the head aren't attached to the head bone, so they won't come along, but you can do the rest. Don't forget to put the armature modifier above the subdiv modifier, so it'll smooth things out right, but also keep it below the mirror modifier, since we want to pose both sides of his body separately. We can mirror the pose if you want to keep them the same, but it's usually a good idea to apply the mirror modifier once you get to rigging, but it's not completely necessary. It will be necessary once we get to rigging the face, for reasons I'll explain then. But here's the issue I mentioned. The way you curl the fingers is by grabbing one of these pins that stick out of them, and then scaling them in, and ouch. A similar thing is also probably happening with the elbows and knees, where they bend the wrong way. This is a problem I dealt with a ton when I was first rigging characters, and I'm still kind of bitter that it took me ages to find anyone who actually explained what was going wrong with it, and how to fix it, so I'm here to do that for you. Basically, the fingers and arms need to be very slightly bent in the direction they're supposed to be bending in the Metarig, in order for the script to know which way to bend them. But our fingers, arms, and legs are all completely straight, so it has no idea about where to bend them, so it's basically just doing something completely random. To fix this, we need to go back into our model and bend all of those a little bit, and then move the Metarig back into place. It should be pretty quick though. You can leave the generated rig there, since you can regenerate on top of it later, but hide it and the Metarig. Then just grab the elbow loop, turn on proportional editing so we can pull the rest of the arm along, and move it back, scrolling up so the influence will get bigger, and it'll keep the arms mostly straight. We only need a tiny bit of bending for it to work, and we don't want to screw up the look, so that should be fine. Do the same thing for the knees. Move them forward instead. My rig's knees ended up fine, but you should still do it just to be sure. For the fingers, we need to move them down at their joints, so select that loop and Shift S to get the cursor in the center. Then select the vert at the fingertip and then press numpad plus to increase the selection, so you just select everything besides the joint loop, or you can just select how you want if you don't have the numpad. Then change the pivot point to the 3D cursor down here and rotate that down slightly with proportional editing on. Make sure it only slightly rotates the joint loop with it. Then just repeat that process for the rest of the fingers. Normally, people have the fingers relax even more than this, but for the sake of simplicity, just rotate the section at the end. For the thumb, I need to rotate it at a better angle, so I'll put my view side on and press R to rotate it against my view. Now, just use Shift S to put all the joints back where they should be. Then, regenerate the rig. The finger pins should be level with the base of the hand itself, and this arrow control at the shoulder and hip should be facing forward, on both the arm and leg. Move the hand around and scale the fingers to double confirm that it worked. It should have, but if it didn't for you, just keep editing the mesh and bones until it does. The more the bones are curled in the direction they're supposed to bend, the less likely it is to screw up. Then parent with automatic rates again, since we move things around a bit. Okay, now the hard stuff is pretty much all done. The whole body should be following the rig, and the arms and legs should be bending as they should. If they don't seem to be bending right, you can try weight painting like I mentioned at the start, but it's hard to tell you what you might need to change specifically. Don't worry about getting things perfect though. I'll say that learning good posing is often what makes a character appealing, not perfect weight painting. To get some of the head parts to follow along, we just need to parent them to the head bone. For the sake of our future face rig, you should only do this for the eye parts, since we're going to rig the rest of the face with some bones, so we can parent those bones to the head instead. You parent them by selecting them, shift selecting the rig, but then you have to go into pose mode, select the bone you want to parent it to, and then Control P, and then click bone. Now it'll follow along perfectly. Do this for the sclera, iris, and eyelash. Everything else will be rigged like normal. You can parent them if you want to pose your guy before the face rigging video comes out, but once we start rigging them, you'll have to unparent them with Alt-P, so things don't mess up. Remember that. This actually made me realize that the ears aren't being pulled along, despite being a part of the body mesh, so we'll have to add those on manually. In edit mode, select them with L, and then in its vertex groups, you can see all the weights it created for this rig. The group we're looking for isn't called head, it's called spine 0.006. Since the head is technically the sixth bone in the spine chain, apply a value of 1 there, and now they're moving along. You may want to do that with the entire head too, if the jaw isn't following along fully. You can also use weight painting, of course, but you absolutely need to have symmetry turned on, as well as this auto normalize setting. Both are super necessary, and I forget to turn them on way too often. Symmetry is obvious, but auto normalize makes it so each vertex will only have a max weight of 1 when you paint it. Without it, you might end up having verts with a value less than or greater than 1, which can cause problems like I mentioned before. The vertex group section also has a setting for this, so turn that on too. I'll repeat this in the next video since I think it'll be more relevant there, but you can add bones to the full rig too for whatever reason, but you absolutely need to remember that regenerating the rig will erase any bones that don't exist in the meta rig. I often add a bunch of face controls and parent them to the head, so I have to make sure I remove those bones from the rig armature group if I need to regenerate it for some reason. You can just select them in edit mode and then press P to get them out of the rig group, then you can regenerate it. Or you can just build everything in the meta rig, as I'll explain right now. Now for one thing I love about Rigify, which is the customizability. The add-on doesn't just add human and animal meta rigs, it actually adds a ton of different complex rig types, which you can build a meta rig for and Frankenstein together. The pre-made meta rigs aren't even anything special, they're just a pre-made amalgamation of these separate rig types it adds. So we can add some more bones to our meta rig, determine what we want them to be, and then add them on to the rest of the rig. I'm going to use this method for the hair. Your character will feel so much more alive if we can animate some secondary motion with parts like the hair, so it's a good thing to rig. Our hair was already turned from a curve into a mesh just for this purpose, but if you didn't do that, go back to the third video in the series to do that. You can rig curves, but it gets way weirder. Here's what my hair geometry looks like, just so you know. Now here's what we do. Hide the main rig and go back into edit mode with the meta rig. We just want to add some bones to the hair. I'll give 2 bones to each strand, since I only want some slight movement on the tips. I also don't have to be super precise about this, since, like I said, I only want some slight movement. I'm not going to be bending these bones at a right angle. With all of that in place, we need to make sure they all follow the head. So select the base of every strand bone, and then the head, then Control P, and keep offset. The tips of the strands are already connected to the base, so it'll all work out. I only realized at the very end that I didn't name my original bone, so I'm going to have to rename each of them. It's a little sloppy, but I can just call the first one I put down hair. Then I select each bone, making sure not to select the head, and then reselect the hair bone. Right-click the name and press copy to selected, and then it'll give each of them a number since it can't have 2 bones with the same name. You usually want to give your bones more unique names, but we don't really need to in this case. Now we have to go into pose mode with the meta rig. Select the base of one of the strand bones, and then in the bone tab, scroll down to where it says Rigify type. This is where you need to tell the script what kind of rig you want these to be. If you click around the meta rig, you can see what it calls some of these parts. A lot of these require a specific organization of bones to work, but some are pretty simple. For the strand bone, click on this box and then select or search Simple Tentacle. This is the type I use for most things like hair, but it also works for things like tails, or anything else that's long. It'll give us way more control of the hair in little ways that would take a while to explain. Once you apply it to one of the bones, you can select all other base bones, select the one you applied it to, right-click that area, and then click Copy to Selected, so it'll apply to the rest of the bones. Remember that only the base bone needs the setting. The script will know to create the tentacle around the connected bones on its own. Now it should work if we regenerate our rig, but let's actually add some more customizability. You know all these rig layer buttons that let you hide stuff? You can customize that section too. Under the Generate Rig button, if you open up this Bone Collection UI section, this is where we can customize all that. But we need to put all the hair bones into a bone collection first, which is at the very top of this section. Just add a collection, call it hair, and then select all the hair bones and assign them to that collection. They would have automatically been assigned to whatever collection you had selected when you added them, so make sure to remove them from that collection too. It should have a dot next to it to show that the bones you've selected are in that group. Now back to the Rigify section, select the hair collection in this top box to edit what the UI looks like. This primary and secondary section were for all the face bones it would have added if we used its super complex face rig, but since we aren't, we can just get rid of them. Just click them and then press the X to get rid of them. Keep the face button since we can use it for when we rig the face ourselves. Then we can add our hair collection as a button to where they were by pressing this arrow here, which will slot it into that place as a button. The plus and minus buttons add and subtract rows, in case you want to add a bunch of buttons. You can also slot it to the right of the face button if you want. And that's all the customizability we need here, so we can finally generate the rig again. It should overwrite the stuff we already had, and now you can see that we have our custom button menu and our new bones for the hair. You need to parent with automatic weights the hair to the rig to get them to work. Then you can rotate these rings to mess with the hair a bit. You can also move them around. I'd probably only end up moving the end bones. The bone at the base of the strand is more just for keeping it in place, but you can do what you want. Also, make sure they're following the head when you move it. If not, just go back into edit mode with the Metarig, parent the strand base to the head, and then regenerate the rig. Also, make sure not to parent with automatic weights with the body now, because the hair bones will then try to drag along part of the scalp, which we don't want. If you do though, just apply a value of 1 to the whole head and ears like I did before, but make sure that auto normalize is selected, so it'll get rid of the hair weights and replace them with the spine 6 weights. Also again, these balls between the rings of the hair are annoying to look at, so let's give them their own bone collection and hide them. I don't think you can automatically give them their own collection, but if you can, please tell me how. So just select all of them and add them manually. Remember to remove them from the base hair group to hide them. It's going to reset the bone collections when you regenerate it, so that might be a step you have to repeat, which is annoying, but it could be worse. I'll go into more detail about how to customize what the bones look like in the next video, but just to give you a place to look at, it's all in the viewport display section of the bone tab when you're in pose mode. We're done with the Rigify stuff, so now here's some tips on how to use everything in the best way. I made a separate doc on how to use Rigify rigs for people who bought one of my models on Gumroad without knowing how rigs work, so I'll link that below too, even though I'll go through most of it here. The first thing to know is what FK and IK are. They stand for forward kinematics and inverse kinematics, respectively. They are basically just different ways in how bones interact with each other when chained together. FK is the simplest, which is how you'd expect bones to move. You move the upper arm, and that moves the lower arm and hand with it. But if you move the hand, the upper arm stays where it is. This applies to all bones up the chain. So the shoulders affect the full arm, the chest affects both shoulders, and so on. These are shown by the green bones in the Rigify rig, and you can toggle them on for each limb in the rig layers. IK is a special one. Basically, it works by placing the hand in one solid place, and then that moves the upper and lower arms as needed to connect to the hand. Then you can rotate the arrows going down the upper arm to determine the rotation of the arm and where the elbow is. All associated IK bones are red in the Rigify rig, so you have the red hand bone and the red gear with arrows near the shoulder. But the green FK bones aren't doing anything, which is because Rigify uses a switch, so you can switch between them as you need to, since they aren't used together on the same limb. To switch it, you need to select either one of the FK or IK bones. And then above the rig layers, there's this slider, so you can slide it from one to the other. 0 is IK, and 1 is FK. Or the text on the slider suggests that left is IK and right is FK, if you forget. This applies to the whole limb of whatever bone you selected, so while this arm is in IK, the other arm is still in FK, and has to be swapped separately. Once it's on whichever side you want, you can hide the other set of bones in the rig layers. There are even these magnet buttons below the slider, which you can use to move one set to the other set's position. So if you pose with FK, then you realize after that you want the bone to be in IK, you can press the IK to FK button to make it have the same position. Now, why should you care about any of this? Well, the good news is, if you only intend on posing a character, you don't really have to care. Just use whatever one feels best to you, which for me is almost always IK. It's just 2 bones to pose per limb instead of 3. Also, IK bones are best for stretching the limb beyond its limits, if you want to do that for a cartoony character. But if you intend on animating them, you definitely will have to care. These functions were made to mimic how the body moves in real life. For example, when you're walking, your arms don't magnetically lock onto your hand, they just swing around. So if your character is walking, their arms should be in FK. However, if you're placing your hand on a table and you move around otherwise, your hand should stay pressed against the table while the rest of you moves. That means you should use IK to replicate that movement. The legs of your character are most often in IK, since your feet stay pressed to one location, in the ground, as you bend over or walk. But they would go into FK if you were falling or floating, as they're not pressed against anything. You can switch between them in the middle of an animation, which is why the switch is actually more like a slider. If you go to one point in the timeline, you can hover over the switch and press I to mark a keyframe. You can then go to a different time, switch it over, and then repeat the steps to mark that other value as a keyframe, and the body will automatically map itself to whichever bones between those frames. This would be great for that scene I mentioned, of placing your hand on a table, since your arm would be in FK up until it hits the table. Then it would need to swap to IK. Thankfully, the Rigify add-on made something like that super easy and accessible, because it would take a lot of effort to add something like that yourself. Now that we got that big part out of the way, here are some other random tips on how to make it even easier to use this rig. For the most part, you can just rotate or move the various parts to see what they do, and you can even scale a lot of them if the situation demands it. One of the best benefits of the Rigify rig specifically is that you can pull lots of these bones apart, which is something you specifically have to set up for a normal rig. They don't like being separated normally. There are a couple of parts that might need some explaining. I already mentioned the fingers, which you can curl by scaling in this pin-shaped bone, but you'll then need to rotate it to bend them down. Then there are these tweak bones, which the Rigify rig adds. You can turn them on in the rig layers. They exist, obviously, to tweak the pose a bit in ways the normal bones won't allow. For example, if you wanted the arm to bend in a slightly more rubber hosey kind of way, you can move these tweak bones out to have that sort of effect. Most of the time, you can just move them a tiny bit, but they can really help boost appeal if you use them right. You can also use the elbow or knee tweak bones to move those parts around if the IK arrow bone isn't working for you, or if you want to put the elbows on a surface. Some bones also can only rotate in specific ways, like the IK arrows for example, which can only rotate around, not forward or to the side. Once you rotate the bone a bit yourself, you tend to figure out what it's there for and which way is optimal. For bones like those, and just in general, it's great to know about your transform orientation and pivot point. I already mentioned the pivot point before when using the 3D cursor as a pivot point, but there are other useful options too. For example, say you wanted to curl in each finger at the same time. If you select them all and scale in, they'll scale towards the center of the whole selection, which isn't that useful. But we can change the pivot point to individual origins, which does what it says it does. If we scale in now, it'll scale in each bone according to its own individual origin point, so it doesn't squish in the fingers. As for transform orientation, it's to the left of the pivot point. By default, it's on global, meaning each of our move or rotate gizmos will always face the exact same way all the time. But sometimes our hand might be in a weird position, so if you wanted to just rotate the finger straight into the palm, it's much harder to do. But if we switch it to normal, it'll figure out where the bone is pointing and give you a gizmo to match that orientation. So we can use this axis to rotate the finger directly inwards, no matter what angle the hand is at. This is also nice for the IK arrow bones at the shoulder, like I mentioned. Having normal orientation on with them means we can rotate them exactly how they should rotate, instead of any other way. Honestly, when posing a character, I rarely have these options on anything other than normal orientation and individual origins, since most bones still work like they should with both of them on, but it's up to you. To say it again, the way you reset a pose is to select whatever bone you want to reset and press Alt and G, S, R, one after another. That resets its location, scale, and rotations, respectively. So you can just press one of them to reset only one thing. If you select every bone with A, you can then do Alt GSR to turn it back to its default pose. Although if you just want to work on your character and keep the pose, under the Data tab, you can turn on Rest Pose, which will force it back into its default position, so you can work without removing your pose. To save a pose, select any specific bones you want to save, or just press A to select them all, and then at the bottom in this pose menu, select Create Pose Asset. It'll let you name the pose, and choose where you want to store it. Selecting User Library means it'll store it in your whole pose library, which you can access from any file no matter what. I have a lot of differently shaped characters, so I don't want their poses to always be in front of me, so I tend to choose current file instead, which will just store the pose in the file you're in. Then press Create, and it'll take a snapshot of whatever the camera sees in solid view to use as the thumbnail for the saved pose. It doesn't use backface culling, so it made our guy look like he's covered in oil, but we can change the thumbnail ourselves. If you split the window and change the new one to the asset library, we can see where the pose is saved. There are a lot of different types of assets in Blender, so to just go to the poses, at the top, change it to current file, where we can see only the current file poses we saved. Then if you select the pose and bring it out on the panel to the right, we can change a bunch of details about the asset. Most importantly, its thumbnail. If you press this file icon, you can select any image to use as the thumbnail. I like having the full render of that pose as a thumbnail, but you can use any image you want. Or you can press these arrows to reset the base thumbnail to whatever the camera's currently seeing. This way, you can turn off our outline, refresh the thumbnail so it looks white again, and then re-enable the outline. One last thing, performance. Things can get laggy when posing a character, but there's a nice setting that'll help us speed it up. In the top render tab, down at the bottom, there's this simplify option. This will let us reduce the complexity across the whole file all at once, giving us instant speed. These parts here let us lower the maximum allowed subdivision levels, so we can reduce them down to 1, and everything in the file gets their subdivisions lowered, which makes us able to pose them much faster. It's basically necessary when there's a whole scene's worth of complex objects. Aside from that, just go to solid view if you need more speed. There are a lot of ways to speed things up, but those two are the main ones. You'll definitely realize you need a better computer once you start posing and animating. It's not really to prevent lag, but if you're animating while there is lag, you'll need to go to this playback setting in the timeline and switch the sync section to frame dropping. This will make your animation always play at the correct timing, where it'll skip frames if it can't load them in time. If you don't have it on, you'll probably find that your end render is moving away faster than you thought it would. And that's all you need to know. Don't forget that there are more tips about using rigs in the stock I mentioned earlier. Next, we'll finally make his face rig, so he'll be fully complete in the next video. Although I'll still show you how to do some things this specific character doesn't need, like adding textures or making clothes in the video after that. So stay tuned. See you then.